Greetings, everybody. My name is Ada Hatcher, and today I will be discussing with you what it means to drink and make a damn fine cup of coffee, the topic for my individual creativity project. At the beginning of this class, I had initially thought that I might experiment with drawing techniques. This has been an area for me that I've always had a lot of insecurities around, and I thought maybe it might be interesting to dig into that a little bit and maybe improve my techniques. But there was a lot of angst around that. And as I was thinking about it, I realized one of my main goals for this project was just to really have fun with it. And so because I had already had summer plans to experiment with coffee recipes, I decided to combine those two things and explore coffee with this project. So why coffee? Why did I even want to explore coffee recipes this summer? This is something I had to think about in the beginning of the process. And I realized that I've had this ongoing desire to have a perfected recipe for a cup of coffee, one of those cups that you serve at your house and somebody else has that experience with you and says, oh my gosh, this is just such a good cup of coffee. How did you make this? And that they wouldn't actually be able to go home and replicate it because it's a very individual experience. So I wanted to have kind of this recipe of my own. The origins of this desire, I really don't know the answer to that. I know that one inspiration that I had was from Agent Cooper from the television series Twin Peaks. If any of you have ever seen the show, it's from the 90s, and it's about this real quirky town, I think in Washington. And Agent Cooper, he was this very kind of handsome, quirky, but sort of smooth, charming character. And he could often be found sitting in a cafe, drinking coffee, interviewing. He was a detective interviewing local people, and somebody served some coffee, but he would always smell the cup, and then he would kind of feel the moment and the place where he was, the environment, and reflect on that for a minute. And if everything was good, he would say, now this is a damn fine cup of coffee. So I've been in search of that cup. And one thing, just reflecting on what I love about coffee, the smell of coffee, even when I didn't like the taste of it, I always loved the smell, the dark, rich aroma. I also had to think about the current methods. How do I currently make my coffee? Which is a get up and go. How can I make the darkest, richest cup of coffee in the least amount of time? I'm a very busy woman. So, but I do like my coffee very dark. I like it very bold, rich, and my biggest goal with coffee is how to match the richness of the smell with the richness of the taste. And so when those two things come together, which I think is often hard to do. I've had a lot of cups of coffee where I thought, gosh, that smells so good. And then it tastes pretty weak. It just doesn't have that that punch. So for me, that's what a fine cup of coffee means. So in going into this process, I knew that I wanted to recreate the experience of, I had an experience in, I think it was about 20 years ago, drinking a cup of Cuban coffee, which is this particular style is Cafe Cubano, or also known as Cafecito. I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. And then I also had to identify my current collection of coffee making apparatuses that my husband and I have in the kitchen. And I knew that I wanted to try out a new recipe. And I had this sub question. What do I do when there is no cream or milk? This is something that I've pondered over this past year, but never really had a chance to figure that out. So that there was an interesting revealing of that throughout the process. So going back into this most memorable cup I had when I was living in New Orleans around 2005. It was shortly before Hurricane Katrina. I was in this in-between phase of my life. Nothing was really quite coming together. So in going back into this experience, I was reflecting on what my life was like at that time. So I think that coffee really had, like I was saying with Agent Cooper, the coffee really has a connection to the moment, whether you realize it at that time or not. And so I was brought back into this experience of what my life was like at that time. And, I moved away from there right before Hurricane Katrina. Um, and so there was that aspect that came up for me. And then there was also just the flavor itself. It was rich, it was dark, and it was sweet. And I shared this coffee experience with my Cuban friend, who made it in the traditional way in his home. And so we had this real nice conversation that went along with the coffee, which for Cubans, coffee is associated with social life and being in cafes and afternoons. And so just the social aspect of it is really important. So it was also really neat to connect to a historical history of another culture. That meant a lot to me. So there was this kind of uh, some negative associations that I had going through researching how to make this coffee recipe, and also this nostalgia too at the same time, and the connection with the Cuban history that was unique for me. And so, like I said, the Cafe Cubano or Cafecito is rich, it's dark, it's very sweet. In America, Cubans commonly use the Cafe Bustelo, which is a really cheap coffee. It's pre-ground. And that was one of the most remarkable things to me about this cup, was the ingenuity of using a cheaper coffee in such a way that produced this real high quality taste. And so I think oftentimes in our culture, we associate a good cup of coffee with um, with expensive coffee. So and we pre-ground, it's never pre-ground. We buy the beans, we uh, ground the beans at our home. That's what my husband and I do. But this stuff, it's easy to find. It's pre-ground. The Cafe Bustelo has its own unique history. It was actually a Spaniard who lived in Cuba for, I don't know for how many years, but spent many years living in Cuba, and then relocated to New York, and then started the company Cafe Bustelo in New York, I think in the early 20th century. And so it's the coffee of choice for many Cuban Americans here, which is that experience that I shared with my friend in New Orleans. So that was pretty neat. So in my research, I went in search of this coffee recipe, and I found one that I thought would recreate this experience that I had. Like I said, it's Cafe Cubano, or also known as Cafecito. It is one shot of espresso and espuma, which is a very thick whipped creamed sugar. And that's made with traditionally raw cane sugar, and you add just a little bit of coffee to it, and you just whip it vigorously for 1 to 2 minutes, and you get this nice creamy kind of caramel colored rich sugar called espuma. And it was used in Cuba because they didn't have a lot of access to fresh cream and dairy products, but they had a lot of access to the sugar. So this was their way of making a rich cup of coffee. So it's very inventive. Inventive. So I had to gather my materials for this recipe. It's the Cafe Bustelo coffee. Like I said, you can find it in Kroger. And the mocha pot, which is this two-tiered coffee pot. It's a stovetop espresso maker. It's the one there with the black handle. I had my measuring spoons, my espresso glasses. You get two because, like I said, for Cubans, the social aspect is very important. And then, of course, the sugar. So here's the recipe. You can take a snapshot of that if you're interested in trying this out. I'm not going to walk you through the whole experience of it because we just don't really have time. But what I can say is that that this was a very successful cup of coffee. When you serve it, and you socialize with friends or family. The results were a damn fine cup of coffee. It came out incredibly rich. It was also, like I said, really, really sweet and much too sweet for me in the morning. I thought I would love to recreate this again for after dinner dessert, maybe when we have friends over for dinner. And I got very positive feedback from my husband. And the taste, it did remind me, it kind of brought me back into that moment of being in New Orleans. So that was pretty neat. I think we all know the experience, the power of the experience of taste and smell, how it can kind of bring you back into another time period. So that was a part of this as well. I named this slide "The Land of the Privileged" because I moved over to using the fresh raw cream in contrast to the life of Cubans. The fresh raw cream from our local farm, which I have weekly access to, so I consider that to be a privilege. Using the same mocha pot recipe, I followed basically the same recipe. Instead of using sugar, I vigorously whipped fresh cream and made this kind of whipped cream, and added a regular sized cup of coffee and poured coffee over the top and drank in solitude. And for me, I have a special association with drinking coffee in solitude in the morning, which is this real peaceful experience for me. So in contrast to the social experience, this is my solitude experience. My results from that were a pretty good cup of coffee. It was lacking in the rich, dark quality, but I would say that this would be a perfect recipe for lovers of a lighter cup. Also, during this experience, we happened to take a trip to Washington, D.C., where my sub-question was answered by my good friend and host there, Chris Whitworth. No cream or milk? Great. Throw your cup of coffee into a blender along with a dollop of coconut oil, and you just blend, blend, and blend. He made this cup for me. I thought it was fantastic. The results for this for me were a damn fine cup of coffee, and my husband was not so impressed. So this brought me to the question is, what is a damn fine cup of coffee anyway? And my husband, he drinks his coffee a day old and very cold. I do not enjoy that experience of it, but will if I'm in a pinch. And so I thought about the subjectivity of good coffee, of what it means to drink good coffee, make good coffee. So in putting all of the results together of these two different recipes, the Cafe Cubano, having the desire for that same strength and thickness without the sugar, the raw cream experiment was successful in regards to taste, but not the thickness. And I made a pretty good cup of coffee. But the real aha moment for me in this was realizing, oh, right, the subjectivity of personal experience, whether it's with what you like to eat, the art you enjoy, the television shows that you like to watch, your movies, whatever. That whatever kind of personal experience you're having, there's a subjectivity to it in terms of what is quality, what's enjoyable. So relating that into coffee experience was a nice moment for me. The verification process. So I have not yet reached my goal of perfecting a cup of coffee at home, and I'll continue to experiment throughout the summer. But I did solve the problem of what happens when I run out of cream, because we always have coconut oil in the house, and so that was a real success for me. The challenges of this experiment, I found that there was a lot of white noise with the coffee experimentation, because anytime I thought about something that might be innovative, it's all been done before. We live in a real coffee culture. And so, but that feeling was overcome by my excitement about my experience with the Cuban coffee and connecting with something historical. I think there's that in itself was a very unique experience. What was not a challenge for me was that I love coffee, that I drink it every day, and that I enjoy every cup, and that I had a lot of tools at hand to experiment with. What came of this? I'm consistently in search of a damn fine cup of coffee. It's not one destination. Agent Cooper enjoyed many cups of coffee throughout the entire series of that show. and that my definition of what it means changes over time.